I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. Today, we continue our conversation on the EU AI Act, this time with a particular focus on how the law impacts cloud-based products and services. If you're picking this episode up and have not heard our prior program that gives an overview of the Data Act, you might want to pause and go back one. The Data Act is so big and so consequential that we had to split up our discussion into at least 3 episodes. One that provides an overview of the law and its implications, and another that focuses on the impact of connected products and services, i.e. any product or service that has an internet connection, maybe that's all of them. And then this one, which focuses on the consequence for cloud offerings. Check out all of them. They'll really give you an overview of what the law is, its implications, and how to comply with them, especially for these core sectors in the technology space. But for today, we're going to focus on cloud. The Data Act is going to reshape cloud offerings in really fundamental ways. Everything from the design of the products to allow for interoperability with other competitive services to IP strategies that may need to be changed with the expectation that there may be loss of proprietary data sets. Cloud providers' business models might also need to shift to make their products, frankly, more commodity-like and allow customers to easily shift from one service to the other. It is a big, big deal for the cloud sector and all of the entities who are operating within the global marketplace. To discuss the cloud and the implications of the Data Act, I've invited Henrik Hanssen back to the podcast. You heard Henrik on our prior overview episode. He is a counsel in our Hamburg, Germany office and spends his time advising clients on the GDPR, the AI Act, cyber, and now the Data Act. Henrik, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Scott. Thanks for having me.
All right. So Henrik, you and I and Christian Tinnefeld on your team just spent time in a prior episode giving background into what the EU Data Act is and learned a lot, including its breadth and significance. But one of the points that you raised on that was that there was going to be specific application of those legal requirements to cloud computing services that are unique and that are worth spending a little bit of time to focus on. I understand there's a separate set of entities, those who are providing connected products that are also uniquely impacted. We'll have a separate episode on that issue. But for this one, really want to understand the cloud component. Given that the cloud is frankly everywhere, it, in some ways feels like it's the Internet of Things, or it feels like it is, AI. It's ever present around us. Saying that there are specific applications to cloud services, I think will have a significant impact on our digital ecosystem. So from your perspective, where do you see the Data Act applying to cloud service providers, cloud services, cloud-based products?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. So yeah, somewhat surprising if you look into the Data Act, it's all about connected products and connected services. But there's also a separate chapter 6, dealing with data processing services. And this really directly impacts the entire cloud computing market. So the overall purpose of the Data Act that we discussed before is to remove lock-in effects. And this also includes vendor lock-in effects that may be imposed by cloud computing providers in practice. And this is why the Data Act in the Chapter 6 introduces obligations for providers of such services to allow customers to easily switch from one service to the service of another service provider of the same service types. There's also an obligation just to allow customers to move basically their data from the cloud service to their own on-prem infrastructure. And this really aims on removing vendor lock-in effects and to sort of address the imbalance of power between providers of cloud services and customers, at least as perceived by the European legislator.
Henrik, that's interesting. So in a prior episode, you described how the EU Data Act works, and in particular, to what extent it will require the effective portability of data from one solution to another. And for users or end users or companies, B2B, B2C, to be able to take data that is, quote, theirs, right, and move it to another platform. Cloud is probably an area where there's a lot of that perceived need for portability because you use one solution in one place and that may work well for you for 2 to 3 years, and then you want to move to another service provider. Could be question of pricing, it could be question of your needs have changed, could be functionality, could be all range of things as to the reasons why you want to move, but you want to move. And what we see in practice is those moves can be very expensive and onerous. There are consultancies that are set up for the purpose of moving data from one solution to another, just given how complicated those moves can be and the need for continuity in any of those moves, such that it really makes it difficult for organizations to move out of a solution that they have been using for a while. Is that what is really designed, that this we're trying to address that dynamic? Or is this an issue really around trying to just to make sure that data is portable from one environment to the other?
Yeah, indeed. It's the first issue. So the Data Act really aims on removing any obstacles that cloud customers have to switch to another provider. And this actually means switching in the sense of the word, meaning that there should be an option to easily move the entire customer data and content that the customer is currently using in one cloud solution to the cloud solution of another provider that's the similar service types. But there are very clear obligation of cloud providers to remove any technical, organizational, or contractual obstacles that may exist in this respect for customers.
Yeah, interesting. All right, so then let's go to the next really difficult issue, and that is what data needs to move. Because this idea of what data is in scope to move from solution A to solution B, I think is a thorny one. And to try to understand, what data relates to the end user and their use of the service versus data that is being used and really is the creator or publisher of the SaaS solution is an important one. You were providing a number of distinctions on our prior episode, and it sounds like it can get complicated quickly to try to sort and classify data appropriately with inside of the technology space. How do you see this question about what data is in scope from a cloud computing perspective?
Yeah, that's one of the core questions. And there's basically two types of data that are subject to the switching requirements. First one is exportable data, which includes any input and output data. So basically any data that a customer submitted to a service or generated through its use of a cloud service. This also includes metadata, which is often also referred to as a usage data, depending on the cloud service, which is just generated also through the use of a service. So such exportable data is subject to the switching requirements. The second data category is digital assets. So that's typically all elements that a customer has stored and used in the cloud environment, which must also be available for switching. So looking at this, the scope would be very, very broad. So this is why there are some exceptions to the data that must be available for switching. So the most important one is pretty any data which is protected as intellectual property and trade secret of the cloud provider, or third party actually, which gives a good basis to exclude certain content and data that is controlled by the cloud provider. In addition to that, there's an exemption for, especially when we talk about metadata, threat intel data, there's an exemption for data types that are used for ensuring the integrity and security of the service. So when they will be disclosed or made available would pose security risks on the service. So there are a couple of exemptions, and the trick really is to find a good determination internally of the relevant data categories, and that must be made available for switching, and then to also make it available or transparent to customers. So as you know, many cloud providers already have a definition for customer data, usage data, and maybe some other data types, which are not limited just to personal data. And the exercise here on the Data Act is really to have a second look into this and check whether the definitions are fit for Data Act purposes or whether there is a need for adjustments.
Yeah. So and that really underscores, I think, some of the points that you made on the prior episode around the need for data mapping, data classification, around trying to make sure that we are coming up with the strategies so that we know what data is going to be governed by what requirements. So let's say that we know what that is, right? And I know that's a big assumption because many organizations don't really know the full scope of the data or know how to classify that. So take it like, let's say we know that. What is the impact? Maybe think about this from the two perspectives. One would be the cloud hosting providers, the SaaS solutions, the different types of cloud-based tech offerings, and then the users of those solutions, which is probably everybody. How, from your perspective, are those two entities, two different groups, approaching this particular law in not only how is it that they need to design the product, but importantly, what should their expectations be around the use of that product once this law is in effect?
Yeah, I think the first touch point for both the users and the providers will be the contractual requirements imposed under the Data Act for allowing a switching of services. So that's really where the service provider and the customers will interact, and maybe very likely also customers will first learn about their rights under the Data Act and to switch services. And to this end, the Data Act really sets forth a list of requirements that must be covered by cloud agreements by 12 September 2025. And here, the question really is on how, as we've discussed earlier, will customers use those rights? Are they keen of switching the services, although they have agreed to long-term contracts before? So that's all open questions. But I think the contractual part and the transparency part will be the first point of interaction, and also the first issues that will be tackled from an implementation perspective when it really comes to the switching.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, do you see that? So if I'm understanding the way the contractual relationships are setting up, that there are some things that perhaps are open to negotiation, some areas that are not, but this is really at bottom the move in the direction of trying to create the default, create the kind of the baseline set of expectations on this key issue around switching and key issues around data portability to now favor, frankly, customer positions than it was the provider positions in the past.
Yeah, exactly. This is the balance of power that the Data Act wants to address, and it's really focusing on the customer and the user, not just because the legislator wants to create benefits for the users, but want to ensure really the free flow of data within the European Union. So as an underlying goal of the Data Act. And this is why the Data Act is so strict with regard to the applications, also on the cloud switching. And this is supplemented by obligations also to ensure from a technical perspective the interoperability of services. So cloud providers will be obliged to ensure that there's an API in place that allows for an easy export of data, for example. There's also a separate process to develop harmonized standards on how those open interfaces should look like in the view of the legislator. So there are really a couple of points to look into when preparing for compliance.
Yeah, makes sense. If I'm thinking about though what that means in practice for, many clients as thinking about that or that contractual negotiations ahead.
Mhm.
And if I'm understanding correctly, there's still even more that's going to be added here in terms of standard contractual clauses, not in the way of international data transfers, but kind of just more literally clauses that will be required for this type of thing. Are we anticipating that, the new world order for EU based cloud services, that we're going to have a rider of sorts, an addendum of sorts that's going to be specific to EU Data Act compliance? And is that, do you think, at this moment, going to be led by the providers themselves, that they're going to try to say, okay, here's the standard terms, much like they do for data processing terms right now? Or do you think that there's opportunities for customers to engage in figuring out the way to not only comply, but balance these competing considerations?
Yeah, very good point. So there's indeed the option to develop standard contractual clauses for the switching requirements. And there's already a draft set of standard contractual clauses available, not officially yet, but it's a 40-page document, so it's quite a complex construct, so to say, which sort of reminds of the SEC for international data transfers. And it reflects to some way what the European legislator has in mind when thinking about the implementation of the contractual switching requirements. When thinking about how this will actually work in practice, I'm a little bit doubtful, given that the wording is indeed, as it is drafted right now, quite complex. And I'm, of course, also not in favor of the cloud providers, and would probably make it difficult to handle for service providers who already have their existing standard terms in place. So my feeling is that most providers, and my recommendation would also be, use the standard contractual clauses as a guidance on what is perceived as a compliant contractual setup by the legislator, but can really take their own approach, developing their own Data Act addendum, for example, or set of switching clauses to really make sure that the contract wording also fits to the service in question. So I think that's how things are going to develop. It's a little bit different from the SECs for international data transfers, because there you are required to use the clauses to benefit from the lawfulness for the data transfer under the GDPR. Here, use of the SEC is not required because you can, if you have your own compliant set of clauses, also comply easily with the Data Act. And there are a couple of points where service providers want to make sure to have their own wording in place. So most importantly, the switching request. So under the Data Act, the switching is triggered by a request of the user to switch services. And there are thousands of questions on that. So what is a request? Who's making the request? How is it delivered to the service provider and to whom exactly? And this is those are all points that can stipulate it in a customized contractual set, and is all the more a good reason to develop customized contractual clauses.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, if I'm taking what you're saying correctly, I think everybody has been trained that you cannot manipulate or modify the standard contractual clauses under the GDPR, right, which are going to set out the lawfulness or be the basis for the lawfulness of the transfer. We're not anticipating that dynamic for the Data Act, but instead the standard contractual clauses would be a starting point for organizations if they choose to use them. But even the use of them initially is a voluntary decision.
Yeah, exactly. They are considered as model contractual terms that serves more as a guidance on how to comply with the Data Act requirements.
Well, it's helpful. I think maybe Henrik, maybe my last question here as we try to, have equipping people to be able to comply with this thing is many, privacy, data security, data professionals within our organizations are taxed by an overwhelming number of developments within this space. And it is not only the fire drills that each of them are going through and dealing with kind of the crisis of the day, but also trying to make sure that they are coming up with more program level developments to meet these big changes. It is I don't know, I don't know how a small team can frankly do all of these things. So if we recognize that that's the dynamic for many organizations as they're approaching this, you covered a few of those things about what to do, but maybe from your perspective, do you have any practice points about where to start? Is that data mapping? Is that data classification? Is it the contracts? Is that all of the above? Interested in your thoughts, how to engage with this law and think about to what extent does it apply? How does it apply? And can I set out a course for compliance?
Yeah, I think 2 points, and those are indeed first the revision of contracts, and the second, which goes hand in hand, is the data mapping or identification of data categories that would qualify as exportable data and digital assets. It's a bigger project to do this, but companies can benefit from other projects because, especially from a cloud provider perspective, many providers are currently looking into also the data categories that they are processing, for example, for the development of AI products, where you need to look into what data types can be used for AI model training, for example. So it's probably an exercise that's in some way already in place or kicked off. But yeah, the goal should be really, and having the deadline of 12 September 2025 in mind, to have at least a good understanding of the data categories, and then also draft up the basic switching provisions, supplemented by a description of the data categories that are eligible for switching under the Data Act.
Well, it sounds like there's just in those things a lot to do. And so, Henrik, I'm sure that you will be quite busy over the coming months and years as you work with organizations to comply with what is really a game-changing set of expectations about how data can be moved within technology, in this case, cloud. In the next episode, we'll talk about connected products and essentially how some of these same issues are presenting there, uniquely and different, but a lot of the same type of concerns around trying to know your data and know how is it that data needs to move, what things can be maintained as proprietary or exempt, what needs to be in the position of being able to be switched. And a lot of thorny questions there for which we'll probably be spending the next decade trying to figure them out. Well, Henrik, really appreciate your time and expertise and sharing that not only with me, but with our audience. And I am looking forward to future episodes where we kind of talk about how pragmatically you're seeing this play out in the marketplace. But I thank you for joining us on this podcast.
Thanks a lot, Scott.
With that, I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and those were your data points.